Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. A big pleasure to be here. So this will be rather verbal, right? It won't be technical, but and I can promise you that it won't be boring. I cannot promise that it's super well structured. You will see, but because there are many topics to be covered, but it won't be boring. Okay. Okay, let me start with the twin crisis. I mean, in principle, we have plenty of other crises as well, but here I focus on two kind of related crises. One is crisis in search in armed conflict. So if you read the newspapers, you will have noticed, right? I mean, we hear about Ukraine, Iran, Gaza, Sudan quite often in the news. And then, of course, the question would be, well, is it something that that is just perception that journalists now have picked this up, but the underlying risk hasn't increased? Well, the graph tells you no. Unfortunately, it reflects actually that the risk of conflict has gone up. So what does this graph tell you? Well, this graph is from 46 to 2024, so the whole after World War II period. You have different types of conflict. So the red is kind of decolonization wars, which thankfully have stopped in the 70s when most countries would have gotten independence. Then you have interstate wars, like the war we see now in Iran at the moment. You see that in terms of numbers, so on the graph you have the numbers of these wars between 0 and the peak is above 50, 60. And so basically these interstate wars, they're often not huge numbers, but all of them are, of course, very, very lethal, right? So even though Ukraine is just one observation, the number of people killed are, of course, very, very shocking. Then internationalized interstate wars. These are wars that would start as a civil war, but then somehow the thing kind of explodes or gets out of control, and other neighboring countries intervene or something. So for example, the Second Congo War, the Great War of Africa, with several million of people dying in the Congo, is a war like that started as a civil war, but then Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, etc., got involved. And then you have the lion's share here are intrastate wars, so the classic civil wars like in Sudan, for example. But I mean, what you see in terms of big picture is that, well, the world has never been as unsafe until the end of World War II, right? We have a sad peak of more than a quarter of countries in the world having some. So we have like, well, some conflicts take place in the same country, but overall, we're in a situation when roughly a quarter of countries in the world have some serious armed conflict. And many of them we never hear about. Central African Republic, most people don't even know that this country exists, but they have a very violent conflict, to give an example, right? So what we see in the news is really the peak of the iceberg. So many reasons to be concerned. And here you see some, graphically where these places are on all continents, basically almost. At the same time, also in terms of the health of the planet, we're not doing that great, right? I mean, I think we're all realizing in this room, if we just take the planetary boundaries of Rockström and others, what you see is that we cross more and more of these planetary boundaries. And so we have these, what I would call a twin crisis. Then of course, there are other crises which are also linked. So maybe next year I will talk about a triple crisis or something, with AI increasing inequality, and then there's the crisis of democracy, of course, etc. So you could talk about more than two, but in order to keep it somewhat tractable today, let's just talk about these two. So the two crises about armed conflict and about climate change and planetary health. Is there a link between the two? How does climate change and armed conflict mutually affect each other? And especially, will the green transition increase or reduce armed conflict? So the fact that we will have to go green if we don't want to die as a species, means that, well, what will be the impact on armed conflict? Will it make matters worse or may it improve things? And then what kind of policies can we put in place that can tackle the two problems at the same time, getting some double dividend? And so with Mathieu Coutenier, we have part of the things on critical mining and stuff is we have this policy paper that is forthcoming where we talk about it. So some of the stuff I talked today are linked to this policy paper in Mathieu. Yeah, so to start, you know, I'll kind of with very simple color schemes. So I try to make a bit of order in the mess. But as I promised you, it won't be boring, but it may not be super structured. So that's the next 3 slides, right? So what you see is that, so that's kind of the starting point, the status quo. We have fossil fuels, which fuel climate change, of course, which are a big driver. At the same time, fossil fuel extraction is a driver of conflict. Climate change is a driver of conflict, and conflict itself also has a carbon footprint that can be very big. So that's kind of the status quo where we are in very simple terms. Now, hopefully, if we stop electing crazy politicians, but we go for more responsible politicians, at some point, we're going to get serious about the green transition. And so with the green transition, a few things will change. The green transition would typically reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. It may hopefully attenuate climate change, but at the same time, the green transition will lead to a surging demand for critical minerals, and the critical minerals may fuel conflict. And so that will be part of the talk, how to avoid this link here, right? So that's the big picture. And then what I'll do, and now it becomes messier, with like all the blue hexagons. So they're policies for peace. So that's my focus here, right? So policies for peace. And I'll talk about a few of them. I'll talk about, first policy for peace is to speed up the green transition. Then I can say now a few words about mining 2.0. Mining 2.0 is something I met at a conference in Clermont-Ferrand. Some Oxford geologists. So these are not economists, but they're really the hardcore geologists who know all the elements of the chemistry table that we had to learn for. They know them by heart and stuff, and they tell you, lithium is there in southern New Zealand. There is the lithium spot, and they've been there and they've seen it all. And so with two of them, we've written together now this kind of policy piece, where we advocate for some kind of mining 2.0, where mining 2.0 would basically make sure that we use way fewer resources to produce these critical minerals in a much less concentrated way. So it's kind of basically what I'm basically clueless, right? But so they know the science behind. I know the writing of the introduction, linking it to conflict and stuff. But so what they explain me is that mining 1.0, what we have now is you have a rock and you crush it and you get basically the metal out in that way. But that's not super efficient. It's kind of not very subtle to just crush the thing. And so mining 2.0, which is something that seems to work, is basically where basically you use the metals that are already in fluids. So for example, and you filter them out, for example, from water, from volcanic areas, or in places where there was fuel extraction. So in kind of oil wells that are not used anymore, you can by kind of washing it with water, kind of extract in a less intense but way cheaper way many minerals. And if you so you kind of you don't get it from the rock, but you get it from fluids, and the good thing, why we're excited about that, is that it's less concentrated. The problem is, of course, with minerals that they're very concentrated. If you have a huge mine, then kind of fighting to control the mine is super lucrative. But if you don't have one huge mine, but you have 1,000 little wells where you can filter out a little bit of the metal, the kind of the risk, the incentives for somebody to fight to get that super mine is less expensive. So yeah, so that's mining 2.0. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the other aspects. I'm going to talk a bit about these things based on an actual paper, so a research paper, and also about my book, The Peace Formula, about other policies for armed conflict. Yeah, so it will be, so that's the big picture of the talk, but you see it's a bit, I try to create order in a big mess, but it's not easy. Okay, let's start with this, the status quo. Where are we? What are all these arrows? Well, first of all, first arrow, fossil energy and armed conflict. Well, there is a huge literature on that. Being narcissistic, I just talk about my work, but there are like, you know, whatever, 5, and there's a second part. Okay, so okay, only half narcissistic, but so there is like. So yeah, I think the best survey on that would be exactly the book of Michael Ross, the Oil Curse. And so basically, as Michael in his book explains, fossil fuels destroy the world in various ways. So they increase the risk of civil war, they increase the risk of interstate wars, they fuel the demise of democracy, they fuel corruption. So it's only bad news, right? And across a range of various outcomes. Here, I just talk about one paper in particular. We have this paper with Caselli, Morelli, QJE 2015. What we do is where we look where exactly the oil fields are located. Where basically, so if Gerhard has an oil field very close to his border, so his mobile phone, right? And I have an oil field really far away from the border, then for me it's really attractive to attack him because my chances of getting at his oil that is really close to the border are much bigger than his chances of getting my oil that is somewhere in the hinterland. And so this asymmetry, where either only one has oil or where they are located in a very asymmetric way, would increase the risk of interstate wars really big time. So it's not just about having oil or not, but it's about the asymmetry of oil. So, you know, like Iraq, Kuwait, where for Iraq it was really easy to get Kuwait's oil, but for Kuwait it would be much harder to get Iraq's oil. So that would be the kind of case where that would fuel this conflict. So oil fuels wars. There are many papers on that. Well, so that was the first arrow. So I start losing already part of the audience. Second arrow. The second arrow, the link between climate change and armed conflict. Again, there is much work on it. I'll just talk about that paper again because I'm excited about it. But really the leaders in this field on climate change and conflict are people around Ted Miguel. So Ted Miguel from Berkeley, together with Salomon Siang, Edmund Burke, Nina von Uexküll, Halvar Buhaug. So these are kind of the people who have worked most on it. Here we just talk about one particular paper that we have with Ulrich Eberle and Matthias Töni. And so basically, what we look at, I skip the technicalities because I want to cover a lot of stuff. But basically what we do is the following. So we take the geolocalized map of Africa, and we just have the little pixels, cells of roughly 50 times 50 kilometers, and we exploit exogenous heat shocks. And when we exploit the exogenous heat shocks, we find roughly the same estimates as the Ted Miguel's papers that they have in top 5 journals, but also in Science and a bit everywhere. And so we find the same estimates as their papers, where basically you would have an increase of a 1 degree Celsius more temperature would kind of lead to 25% more conflicts. It's something that's roughly the ball game that we're looking at. What we do, in addition to what they do, is we take into account the ethnic landscape. What they do is they just look at temperature shocks, but of course, given that we have all these papers on ethnic conflict, we were kind of interested in looking at whether this varies by ethnic conflict. And in particular, we were wondering whether if in a given cell you have at the same time herders and settler groups, whether this makes it much more dangerous. And here I'll just present you the results without the regressions. So yeah, I mean, in general, these nomad settlers conflicts are very widespread. A third of conflict fatalities in Africa take place in mixed areas where you have settlers and herders. But these mixed areas, they only account for 13% of the land area. So they're very overrepresented in terms of violent conflict. And many people claim that there's a link with climate change, but it hasn't been really shown so far. And so what do we find? Well, so basically what we do, we take these temperature patterns across Africa. We take these settlement patterns where the different groups are. And so places where you only have groups that are historically, in terms of ethnographic information, nomadic groups are in blue. Places where already for centuries groups have been settled and do crop farming are in green. And then you have the mixed areas where kind of the two styles of production would clash, and where you have some conflict of resource competition between some herder group and some settler group. And actually, these conflicts are very, very frequent between herders and settlers. I mean, The Economist has had a few articles on that. And if you look at the numbers, you know, especially in the Sahel region, so it's mostly in the Sahel region in countries like Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, where kind of this place is completely where the security has become really, really challenging in the last few years, and where you have these mixed groups. And so what we find in our estimates is that a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature would increase by 54% the conflict frequency in mixed areas compared to 17% in non-mixed cells. So it means on average, we're still at the 25% that Miguel finds, but the 25%, they hide a huge heterogeneity where places with ethnic competition have twice as much this effect, and the others, they have a lower effect, meaning that in places with mixed group, the effect is 3 times bigger. And so then if we combine that with a forecast on an average scenario of global warming until 2040, what we see is that the problem for the Sahel region is twofold. The Sahel region suffers from the fact that at the same time, you have a lot of mixed groups between settlers and herders. And at the same time, these are also places where geologically the heating is particularly strong because of the soil quality, etc. Heating is stronger there than in other places, right? We know that it's not uniformly the same everywhere. And that's why the conflict risk goes up by more than 7 percentage points in that region. Yes?
Can I just make 2 points?
Yeah.
One is that there is an additional source of heterogeneity here that is very important, and that is polygamy.
Yeah, okay.
In parts of Africa where one guy has many wives and lots of young guys have no wives, they will be areas where there's lots of strife and conflict and violence.
Yeah.
The other thing is that you only look at heating here, on the right.
Yeah.
Precipitation will also matter.
Yeah.
And there are areas in the Sahel area where forecasts also show that it will be warmer, but that will be countermanded by more precipitation. Okay. So some of these areas you will actually see less. You may see less conflict.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, very good point. So polygamy we haven't looked at, but it's true that there is this literature by Hendrik Oordal and others that look at youth bulge and look at unemployed young men that who cannot found a family for a variety of reasons. That these are more inclined to engage in violent conflict. So it is something we could look at, and it's with respect to the other one. We have some follow-up work with Uwe Sunde where we look at both extreme events with wet extreme events like flooding and also heat waves like droughts, but using indices like the Palmer index that would take into account both the temperature and the precipitation. So it is something we also look at in current work. In this work, one idea, one paper, one. But yeah. So in current work, we look at that as well. Yeah. So okay. So let me. I have only 45 minutes, and so yeah, I'll have to move a bit quicker. And so yeah, so basically what we find in that paper is like resource competition, and we find climate-induced mobility. So what happens is that the herding groups, they have for centuries kind of herded their cattle, but they always knew the same group. So if I always herd my cattle and I always go up to Julia, and so we're friends, we have a cup of tea, there's not much of a conflict. But now this year, I'm so desperate. It's so hot that I have to herd my cattle earlier in the year and further away. Now I have to herd my cattle up to really the end of the room. And now I clash with groups who I don't know. And so that's kind of one of the reasons. The policies that help, in our paper, we find democratic institutions, property rights, dispute settlement mechanisms. But then there are some really cool papers, very impressive one by Kai Gehring and Cotter, where they find that cattle insurance can make a big difference. And then there is work by Nathan Nunn and Ian McGurk, where they find that multilateral aid programs need to be designed in a smart way, making sure that they're not only helping crop farmers, but also herding groups. So if they are more balanced with that respect, the risk of conflict also goes down. So there is, again, something we can do about it. While, of course, the best thing is to just, reduce climate change. Now, the arrow also goes in the other direction. As I was saying, wars also harm the environment. So there is, I think that's what I was supposed to talk about, right? So this is one slide. Sorry for that, but the thing is that I'm really, I'm a one-trick pony. So my main thing is about policies for peace. So that's why the arrow in the other direction only gets like some smaller part of the presentation. But you see that, of course, I mean, there are all these case studies of the Gulf War where kind of Saddam put the oil wells on fire, etc. You also see in the Ukraine war at the moment that this is, of course, very, very bad for the environment. So now I've talked about the red part of the status quo. Now let's talk about the green transition. What will it mean? So now we're in the green part. Well, it means that there are opportunities and risks. So the opportunities are clear, as I was saying. If we get away from fossil fuels, then we can get rid of the oil wars, and we can also attenuate the risk of war that is fueled by climate change. So this is the upside. What's the downside? Well, the downside is that, of course, minerals are also valuable resources over which people may fight. And there is a whole literature. Again, Michael Ross, Collier and co-authors, Melum and Möne from Oslo, Torvik from Trondheim. Plenty of people have contributed to that, where basically, you know, critical minerals, there are all these reasons why critical minerals may increase the risk of conflict, feasibility on financing, a price to be stolen, weaker institutions, factory allocation, migration within a country, etc. And then there is also a reason why mineral extraction could kind of help peace. That's in blue. So the color code is as simple as it gets, right? Red is bad, is conflict. Blue is good, is peace. So sorry for being Manichaean to a shocking degree. But so the opportunity cost channel is really the idea that, well, this gives livelihoods to people. But then what does the data say? Well, the data, here I talk about a paper of that we have together with Nicolas Berman, Mathieu Coutenier, and Matthias Dönig. This mine is mine. And in that paper, what we find basically is, well, it's not good news. It's basically that up to a quarter of wars in Africa can be explained by competition about fighting over mines. And what we find is that if you capture a mine, then you're 3 times more likely to carry on fighting somewhere else. So if you capture a mine, then the likelihood that the war gets spilled over to other regions because now you have money to buy Kalashnikovs is really much bigger. So it has really a very negative effect. And also, of course, geoeconomic tensions. Now, thankfully, what we also look at in the paper is that there are things we can do about it, which brings me to the policies of peace. So now that we've spent like half an hour talking about the problems, we now have like roughly, well, a bit more maybe, no, because you had maybe 20 minutes to talk about the solutions here in blue. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this here, and that's basically, so how can we avoid conflicts over mining? Well, as we in our paper, what we find is that you have this conflict risk that goes up by 25 percentage points if you have if you have a mine in a place. Actually, if the mine is well run, if the mineral in the mine is covered by some transparency initiatives like the Kimberley Protocol for diamonds, then the effect almost goes away, almost completely goes away. And also if the mining company has kind of a sound corporate social responsibility score, it also almost goes away. So if the mining is done by reasonable companies who are not evil, but kind of try to, you know, take into account local communities, and if there's transparency, actually the problem is way smaller. At the same time, what we should aim for is decentralization of energy production. So if, you know, everything that is centralized is a source of big trouble. Like, for example, Sudan and South Sudan, they have had wars fueled by the fact that they have a huge oil field at the border, and you can pump the oil from 2 sides. So it's exactly recipe for disaster. While if you have some energy sources that are kind of very decentralized, the problem is much easier to solve. So Swiss energy comes, like half of it is water energy from like 3,000 power plants that belong to the local municipality. So you're somewhere in the, well, we're lucky we have a lot of mountains and a lot of rivers, right? But your municipality is there, and the money gets distributed as a tax discount to people. And so the local community really benefits. And also, of course, also the solar panels. I don't know how it's here, but at least in Switzerland, the sunk cost of getting the solar panels is paid back after roughly 10 years, but the things operate for 30 years. So it's an incredible investment in general, besides the obvious environmental benefits. So you want to decentralize things. A lot of sustainable energy in a decentralized way, not one big solar plant that can be captured by rebels, but a bit everywhere on rooftops and stuff. Where you want to provide local jobs. You don't want to have a company that comes with just workers from the producing country, but you want to create local jobs. You want an equal distribution of benefits. again, it goes down a bit to the discussions we had, you know, in earlier sessions about how progressive or regressive green policies are. The problem is that we want green policies that are progressive and not regressive. Because if they are regressive, then people will be against them, like the yellow vests in France. While if they're progressive, then we can kind of reduce inequality at the same time as going green. And that's what we should aim for, right? We should have an equal distribution of benefits and also avoid local environmental degradation. Yeah. Okay, so then let me. Okay, so then let me talk about the last point, the peace formula. What kind of general policies that are not necessarily linked to the environment, but in general can help us to get peace? And there I'll talk a little bit about my book. So that's the book, right? Called The Peace Formula. It's written in a way that is kind of accessible. So it has a long appendix with a lot of, you know, citations of hundreds of papers, mostly by other people, not by me. But the main text has no jargon, no technicality, nothing. So what are the key elements of this peace formula? So based on these, a few hundreds empirical studies of what kind of things increase and decrease the risk of conflict, what you see is, to slightly simplify, you can think of three pillars. One is voice, democracy. The second one is work, providing opportunities for people to get, you know, to get ahead in life, to thrive, to have opportunities, perspectives in life, and then third, warranty, security guarantees. And so I'm going to say a few words about all of these aspects, but of course a bit quick. So one American president who we appreciate more than maybe other American presidents, Abraham Lincoln, he said, "Those who shall have tasted actual freedom, I believe, can never be slaves or quasi-slaves again." So the idea being that it has really a multiplier effect. So if people have at some point lived in a country that is well run, where people have opportunities, where they're represented, they will kind of try to oppose anyone trying to confiscate these rights from them. So if you manage to kind of achieve sustainable, inclusive peace at some point somewhere, it will have spillovers in the future. And so the structure of the book is, the first part is why we should care. What are the costs of conflict? I'll skip that for today. The second part is why wars occur. What are the drivers of wars? And the third part is give peace a chance. So what are the policies that work? And so far, I've managed to translate it in French. That the German translation should also work out. But if it's possible to translate it in Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, or Danish, if you have contacts, let me know. Okay. So let me start talking first about democracy. Democracy is absolutely fundamental, and I'll give you the story of Switzerland. Is there any other fellow Swiss in the room? No. Okay. So in Switzerland, actually, we had a civil war. The civil war in Switzerland was the Sonderbundskrieg, which was in 1847, and it was basically the Catholics against the Protestants. And it was like the latest in a string of wars that was for all medieval times. So in medieval times, Switzerland was kind of the most violent and poorest country one of the poorest countries in Europe. And our main export was mercenaries that would fight on all battlefields in Europe, okay? So we're not doing well. And the Catholics and Protestants, they would have a string of wars all the time. And Switzerland has roughly 50% Protestants, 50% Catholics. So we were not helped by the religious geography. We're like the battleground, if you like. Now the problem, then there was the war in 1847. 1847, the Protestants wanted to create a liberal kind of nation state in the era of the time. while the Catholics wanted to keep a loose alliance and wanted to create their own special alliance, and then that was the reason for the war. The Protestants won. The Protestants then had the choice. Either we do the default option of medieval times, just to massacre the losers of the war, or we try something new. Thankfully, they tried something new, power sharing. So they created the Swiss Constitution of 1848, where we have like a coalition government. So we have all biggest party in the government in Switzerland since ever. So we had the same 4 parties in our government for now 100 years, representing 80% of the Swiss voters. A very federalist constitution, proportional representation, bicameralism, and also direct democracy. Okay, direct democracy where we vote on everything. This has kind of transformed the country from one of the poorest and most violent in Europe to go to the more closer to Sweden and Denmark and these countries, right? Okay, and so Northern Ireland is not very different in some sense. If you think of the Good Friday Agreement, that you had all these decades of war. Think of the U2 song "Sunday Bloody Sunday" about the massacre in Londonderry, where the English police forces would shoot into the crowds, and then there were the decades of conflict. And then they had this Good Friday Agreement brokered by Tony Blair and others, where basically they did power sharing at all levels: government, parliament, police force, etc. And it has worked amazingly well. And so that would be examples. And then there are plenty of papers that go in the same direction. So Lars-Erik Federmann has worked, Hannes Müller has worked on that, for example. So clearly the thing works quite well. So then I skipped that. State capacity is kind of important. So here you have the origin of the mafia in Sicily, because there was a vacuum in state capacity. One of the things we can do to increase state capacity is UN blue helmets. So the world expert on the question is 1 hour commuter train from here in Uppsala. Lisa Hultmann, Hanne Fielde, and some other people from UCDP are exactly at the forefront of this research, and their papers are I find them very convincing, good identification strategies, and they find very strong effects. Things like blue helmets would make a huge difference in terms of creating more security. Now, of course, what we should do is we should increase the funding of the UN, and what we are currently doing is, some superpowers think that we should cut the funding. I disagree. Then investing in peace. So there are plenty of papers that mostly are some RCTs, but mostly natural experiments as well, but that look at particular ways in which we can make economies more productive. We can work construction, we can invest in health. There are labor market programs, workfare insurance programs, etc. And many of them, they show very strong effects. That if people have, people are not sadists. People, if they have the choice of having a cozy job with a cup of tea, good salary, and being relaxed, 99% of people prefer that over having a Kalashnikov and running around and shooting people. People don't enjoy violence on average. So the people, being a rebel soldier is a job. And so people do that job if they don't have other opportunities. If people have other opportunities, they will not volunteer to do that. They're not nuts, right? And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And there is all this armada of papers that shows exactly that. So then, well, let me skip that maybe. Well, I can just say a few words that what's important is that, of course, we can all play a role here. So another US president asks not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, JFK. So what you can do, I think the way, I mean, the problem is, of course, you say all these policies. So what we should do for fighting climate change, what should we do for fighting conflict, etc. And so basically, well, we know kind of policies that work, but then the problem is that they're not implemented. And so why are they not implemented, and what can we do about it? The problem is that there's three kind of mindsets. One are the mindsets of ideologues. I know quite a few of them. So the ideologues would be people who write the conclusion of a paper before kind of doing the study, right? They know already before the paper what they will find, because and so I know quite a few people like that. And I mean, on the dark side of the examples of ideologues, you would have the Red Khmer, you would have, you know, some people who would believe very strongly in their cause, but then at the end of the day, you know, 1 million people are dead. So that's that we don't want to go there, right? And then there are the kleptocrats. They're the, you know, the dictators who either do insider trading or then they do shopping trips to Paris and they kind of, you know, they fill their pockets. We don't want to go there neither. So what we want is something where we care. We're not selfish, but we want to be evidence-based. And so that's kind of, I think, what we should. And I think many of the things we've seen this morning, for example, on how to convince people about green policies is exactly that, right? We need to make sure that the green policies are in the interest of people, and then we need to communicate them well, but they need to be evidence-based. For conflict, one thing that is quite clear, which is linked to that point, is that people are protected by the public eye. So if we are kind of active citizens, we write op-ed, we do stuff, we are engaged, then we can make a big difference rather than watching grumpy cat videos on TikTok, right? Because basically what you see in a few papers is that politicians, the stuff that they know is really unpopular, they do that exactly at the moment when the world is distracted. So there are plenty of examples of stuff that was exactly done in the middle during the midtime midtime show of the US Super Bowl or something, where if every American watches the Super Bowl, that's exactly the moment to kind of pardon some people or something. Or so that's something there is quite some evidence on that. And so having active scrutiny of what people do is really, really important. Then there's a big role for global coordination, which again, sadly, in very recent times is going in the wrong direction, with kind of international Geneva, etc., being defunded, not increased in funding. But in principle, things like monitoring mining, regulating multinationals, generous asylum policies, kind of regulating weapons trading. In general, trade is a force of good. I can say more about that. And then one thing that's really important is this result, which people often call the only physical law of social science. Is basically well, it's not from me, the result, so it's not like that. It's by political scientists, that the democratic peace result. It's basically the idea that a democracy is extremely unlikely to attack another democracy. So you have wars between autocracies and democracies, between autocracies and autocracies, but you almost never have a war between a democracy and another democracy. Think about Sweden and Denmark having a war. It's impossible, right? Or Switzerland and Austria or something, right? So maybe it was a bad example, but you see, it's something that makes us laugh. It seems way less likely a war between Denmark and Sweden than between two autocracies fighting each other. And so, I mean, fundamentally, if you want to prevent international wars, the higher the share of democracies in the international system, the better. Now, the problem is, of course, that when you saw in the graph at the really beginning where the wars have increased big time for the last 15 years, it's exactly the same 15 years where democracy scores around the world have collapsed. So clearly there is a link about that as well. So take-home message to finish on time. the green energy transition is likely to be peace positive. So in principle, especially if we put in place strengthening of democracy, strengthening of multilateral rule and coordination. So in principle, if we follow these kind of basic principles of reasonable policies, then we should be able to get at the double dividend of having at the same time fewer armed conflicts and also less environmental costs. So to finish on a quote of Henri Dunant from Geneva, only those crazy enough to think that they can change the world will succeed in doing so. So the guy founded the Red Cross. So that was good. Okay, yeah.
Hello, everyone. This will be a short presentation. So keynote is done. I think we all have between 5 and 10 minutes for it also. My name is Hanna Hotkich. I'm originally Ukrainian, and I will today talk about our work that we are doing in Stockholm Environment Institute, where I work at the moment, here, all in the same city, not so far away from this building. So I will talk about work that we do within the project called Green Agenda. The logo on the left, it's SIDA funded, Swedish Development Agency, and it's showcasing basically what Europe and donor support, but also global donor support, how these funds work in Ukraine. So it will be very much applied example of how green transition works, and it also concept-wise quite smooth. Also transition from your presentation, Dominic. Of course, I was thinking that now when we talk about green transition work in Ukraine, I will call it a policy for peace. But then your last slide was that it's most likely policy for peace. So I'm not sure anymore if that is how we should label it. So really, let me see. It's not working. Am I doing something wrong?
I think you're holding it upside down.
Okay, yeah. That's it. Thank you. Just first about Stockholm Environment Institute. So we are not a university. Sometimes I feel a bit like an imposter in the academic audience, but it is, we do academic research as well. But we label ourselves as very much applied research to policy to practice institute. We work on a variety of sustainability, climate, sustainable finance, development related topics. Originally, traditionally, a lot of SCI research was based in the global south. This is where also Swedish development funding went to fight poverty and support various sustainability solutions to create sustainable world for all. So hence this, so you see the geography where global headquarters is here in Stockholm. We also have regional offices, and those of them in the Latin America, Africa, and also in Asia in Bangkok. So that's basically also the result of historical where Swedish development funds flew. Now we work in Ukraine. That's recent. That's new for this institute. We started working in the region only after the full-scale invasion in 2022 in Ukraine, which is so it is still a new area of geographical work for our institute, but not new area in terms of what exactly we do and type of activities. Although, of course, having the several challenges together, that's not a very common and straightforward task. So in Ukraine, we implement this project that originally was intended to support European integration of Ukraine. I know that not all of you are here from Europe. So for the context, Ukraine is a candidate member to European Union, which means that there are also some other countries that are candidates to become European Union members. In practice, that means that you have a very long list of negotiation chapters on various topics and reforms, and you need to deliver on rule of law, energy market, agriculture policies, and a lot of different things. And that's part of a EU accession. And this is what a lot of also technical support money, it's called in Europe, support for these candidate states to help them with reforms. In case of Ukraine, that's of course, well, double or triple challenge. Ukraine is also a country at war, and that's unprecedented. How a country at war also aspires European Union membership and undergoes reforms and also builds its economy at the same time. So basically we frame this work that we do as a very small project, just one of the examples how, again, we support green transition in Ukraine, how we shape also the narrative of green transition around that it's both good for rebuilding and reconstruction. That is a massive scale in Ukraine due to the destruction and Russian attacks. That is also the only possible way that you can aspire EU membership. And if you're interested in building long-term resilient and competitive economy, also being a European Union member state. So that is, you cannot achieve all of these goals at the same time without actually pushing hard on a green transition. That's at the level of narrative and the political message. To that now we will be adding, that is also a project for peace, green transition reference in Dominic and the literature. So this is how we work practically. As a research institute, we, again, within the framework of this project, we are working with the central government. So for whatever we do, we need to have buy-in from the central national government in Ukraine. We collaborate with Ministry of Economy, Environment and Agriculture in Ukraine. That used to be 3 different ministries, now 1 big, which makes it some tasks simpler, sometimes tasks harder. Also, as a so when you want to support green transition in a country with, and we are a research institute, we usually work with data and tools and various instruments that support evidence-based decision making. You also want to build capacity, and in case of Ukraine, capacity of the government is quite weak. So the way we work is we have a matching research partners. At the moment, we work with Green Transition Office and Dixie Group. I don't know if any of you know. I know that maybe the next speaker, my colleague from Stockholm School of Economics, will definitely know this sector. So these are basically strong, established research institutes. They usually have NGO status. So in Ukraine is also a special thing that whatever is called NGO is not only doing advocacy work. A lot of NGOs actually have technical capacity and good expertise. And this is just a legacy. When you have weak government, you have strong NGOs that actually do a lot of work and also drive reforms and help writing legislation and help with implementation and so on. So basically whatever we do with our research / policy advice, different tools, we make sure that we build capacity here. And these guys on the national level and the policymakers at the ministry basically give buy-in, participate, but we're not super concerned if we don't train ministers or deputy ministers or people within the ministries because they change way too often. So we make sure that we build capacity at the level of research institutes and NGOs. And in terms of how we work from our side, we implement projects from this work in Ukraine from Stockholm, from Tallinn office, and from United States. So that's also global collaboration with the CI tools. Now, what we exactly do, as I mentioned, we do tools. We have some tools that have many years and decades of histories. For example, this one. I don't know if you are the academic crowd that might use this, but a lot of energy modelers, for example, in Europe, they would know this tool. This is something that's been existing at SCI for many years. This is the most used tool globally for many countries to design their nationally determined contributions when they prepare for COPs, for example. So this is how used for carbon inventories for many countries. And and this is something that we developed specifically within this project. It's a very simple macroeconomic tool to support policymakers. I'll talk a bit more about it. So this is basically how we practically support decision making. We understand that and in Ukraine at the moment, it's quite a strong political buy-in in terms of that green transition is important, but I think it's still, in many cases, by decision makers seen as the vehicle to become a EU member. We need to do green reforms because then we can become a EU member. Then we have security guarantees. But the direct connection between green transition is also better use of money, and it also creates long-term economic resilience. So that is, for that you usually need numbers, and this is also where we're trying to be helpful. So what we basically do is we look at the 4 sectors of economy that we start now with the Ministry of Economy with the biggest emitters, and that's traditionally energy sector. That is also industry. In case of Ukraine, this is also agriculture, and we basically look at technology versus investment. We also would have usually studies, more interdisciplinary studies around database tools on what set of policies, would be relevant, how to address the social justice in connection to specific sectors. We also, for example, look at agriculture and forestry at the moment, for which we also have model. Model usually also means that you would bring all data available in the country together, and then immediately you see how many gaps are there. So that's also usually invitation to actually collect all these pieces of data from different places. And for agriculture studies specifically, it's a lot of research ongoing in various academic institutions around Europe, where satellites images are used to understand how much land we actually have available. You know, what agriculture is huge and important sector in Ukraine. Big chunk of territory is occupied. So we basically not even sure what is the total land stock we're talking about if we plan agriculture development for the next decades. So this is also helpful just to actually model physical stocks and see like, okay, what are the perspective of economic development and how much actual resources we have left, and what is the state of quality of soil, for example, if it's agriculture, where is pollution. So in that sense is also we're not collecting primary data. We rarely collect primary data ourselves. So we don't do, monitoring devices, environmental lab analysis of pollution, for example. But we do, so kind of bringing these simulation tools that would have a lot of components help us to actually bring others people data together to see how it might impact the economy. So yeah, this is basically ongoing work. If you're interested, there will be publications coming later this year on iron and steel sector and on agriculture and on energy. This is just a snapshot of this climate neutrality tool. This is something that we usually communicate to government. This has been launched actually 2 weeks ago. We were in Kiev and trained policymakers on this tool and signed the license agreement for them. So it's free to use. We don't take money for our tools, and we try to make sure that we build something that can be easily maintained, and then that they have their own capacity to develop new scenarios, feed in new data, and because of course models would never show the exactly correct results. All models are wrong, some are useful, and we just basically try to make sure that we give instruments so the local actors in Ukraine, governments and experts can then use them. And here is just a snapshot how, according to the current run of the tool with the current data, where we put all the main emitters. So it's not the entire economy, it's mostly biggest emitting sectors. So, and then we basically design scenario how much full carbon neutrality of the sectors together would cost. And then this number is at what we have at the moment, and that's not the correct number necessarily, but it is a decent estimate in comparison to, for example, damage assessment reports that are done for Ukraine yearly. And this is how we basically start political discussion and dialogue, and then with the governments and industries that we can see, okay, this set of technologies would cost this much money, and this is the benefits and costs that are associated with this technological path for this specific industry. I'm done. And that was supposed to be, the last slide. So basically, there's just a showcase in the type of work, quite applied, practical, how we work with government, how we do type of research that informs decision making and hopefully rebuilding decisions in Ukraine right now. That also would be helpful for European integration. And the message is always straightforward, that together with whatever modeling tools, you cannot delay transition. It's a waste of resources, money, and opportunities. And it is a project for peace at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm actually super happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, but I'm also sad and embarrassed because I can only be here now and couldn't be in the morning. I'm missing all the great talks and I can't be here tomorrow. And it's because today is my son's last day in school. It's his birthday tomorrow. My daughter graduates from high school tomorrow, so I have to cook and host for 60 people. So apologies, and I mean, I see a lot of faces that I know and interesting topics, but I'll miss it. Okay, so I'm going to talk for I think like 10 minutes. Try to just wrap up the whole energy economic warfare between the EU and Russia for the last 4+ years. It's based on research and various policy reports that I've written, largely with Johan Gars and Henrik Wachtmeister, but it's also based on work by some people in this room too. So this is the Baltic Sea. We're here, right? We have a bunch of countries, and this area is thanks. This area is very interesting from an oil production perspective, because about 5 million barrels per day are being transported by sea through the Baltic Sea. This is about 5% of all world oil consumption. It's about half of Russia's oil exports, 5% of Russia's GDP, and 10% of its government revenue that goes this route. And this is only oil. There's also gas, but I'm going to talk about oil. What does it look like in terms of countries? Well, most of the coastline here is, of course, belong to various EU countries, and a little bit of the coastline belongs to Russia. Why is that important? Well, because it depends on who's going to care if there's some kind of environmental problem that occurs in the Baltic Sea. Why do we care about the environmental problems? Well, because the Baltic Sea is narrow, especially here, where all the oil tankers have to go out. It's shallow in places, and it's very tricky to navigate. So it means that this is difficult waters. It also has a very sensitive environment, because this is essentially like something between a lake and a sea, because the only way that the water comes in is through this narrow channel and then through rivers. So there's a very slow turnaround of water, and also it's very cold. So that means that if there's some kind of accident with an oil tanker, it's going to take forever to kind of break down. It's not going to dissolve very quickly. There's high property values because there's a lot of countries here, right? Rich countries. And it's predominantly, most of the coastline belongs kind of to the EU, both the waters and the coastline, in fact. So this is kind of the backdrop. I'm going to talk now about the sanctions. And oh, sorry. Just to also continue with the size of this. So it takes about 2 to 3 days for a tanker to go the route out of the Baltic Sea. This means that at any given moment, there's going to be 10 to 20 full tankers. And the same number of tankers go the other way, but they're going to be empty. Some 50 million barrels of oil are in the Baltic Sea at any given moment. It's very hard to estimate the costs of an oil spill here. But just to give you an idea of how much oil there is on this type of tanker. So if we would take all the barrels of an oil tanker and just put them side by side, it would be a wall which is 400 kilometers long. And you can imagine if there's an oil spill and the winds are kind of bad, you can get hundreds of kilometers of oil in the water. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit more about my analytical process when I think about these things. So I tend to think about what's going on now as some kind of economic warfare. What do you want to do in economic warfare? Well, you want to harm your enemy economically, right? But you also want to make sure that you conserve on your own resources. You don't want to just waste your own resources. So essentially, your objective function is that you want to maximize your own income minus the enemy's income and then some weight on the enemy's income. So that's the first thing. That's what you want to do. But you also have to take into account that the enemy might use countermeasures. So it's not like you can just implement sanctions and things like that. And importantly, these countermeasures, they're going to be implemented not as if the enemy is some kind of profit maximizer, but the enemy will like to, on one hand, maximize its own profit, but also to harm you. Now, the question is, how much does the EU want to harm Russia? How much does it want to conserve on its own resources? How much would Russia want to harm the EU and conserve on its own resources? Well, turns out if you analyze this kind of model, then the country with the highest military spending is going to put the lowest weight on harming the other country. What does this mean? Well, it means that EU, which spends much smaller share of its income on military, is going to focus on harming Russia economically. Russia is going to focus on protecting its income, not harming the EU economically. It's going to focus on harming the EU in other ways. So it's kind of an asymmetric economic warfare that goes on. All right. So bear this in mind when we go on. Now I'm going to talk as if this is a TV show. So go back. We're in 2022. Russia just invaded Ukraine full scale. What happens? Well, the EU stops buying Russian oil, especially the seaborne oil. What does this mean? Well, Russian oil came out this way. It also comes out this way, a smaller flow. And this oil used to go to Europe, but Europe stops buying this. So now Russia has to transport it all the way to India and China. What does this mean? Well, Russia loses profits due to higher transport costs. And also it loses bargaining power because now it doesn't have so many countries that buys its oil. So that means that India and Russia, they can squeeze out a discount. There's not much of an effect on the EU. This is the discount, by the way. So these are huge numbers if you translate this. Episode 2. Then the G7 countries, they implement a price cap on Russian oil. And they say that if Russia is going to use Western-controlled tankers, then it cannot sell the oil for above a certain price. So the price cap was set to 60 to begin with. And the important thing here is that the price cap worked through the tanker fleet. So because the West, or G7, they had the biggest share, or essentially most of the tankers, they were using Western insurance. So this meant that the West had control of the tanker market. As a parenthesis, we cannot understand sanctions unless we understand the transport market. And for oil sanctions, we have to understand the tanker market, and there's hardly any research on this. There's not even a price elasticity for the tanker market. If you want to do something like that, would be great. End parenthesis. What happens then? Well, Russia understands that in order to circumvent the price cap, it has to build up the shadow fleet. What does this mean? Well, the shadow fleet is a bunch of tankers that Russia essentially controls, that don't use Western insurance. This is where the environmental threat comes in. So it buys up and starts using oil tankers with unclear ownership and that doesn't have any insurance. So this means that if there would be an accident, essentially the countries that are subject to the accident are going to end up paying for it. And at any given moment, there's going to be about 12 full shadow tankers of oil in the Baltic Sea and 12 empty ones. And of course, the empty ones, they still have a lot of fuels for themselves for their own fuel. So they are an environmental hazard too. So this is the environmental threat. With the help of this shadow fleet, Russia restores the price. It gets a higher price for its oil. So this is important for it. It also gets a lower transport cost. So this is Russia's countermeasure. The EU faces these environmental threats. There's also been some near misses of tankers that hit how do you say, grynna, hit land or shallow water. Episode 4. Then, especially the Baltic countries, they start sanctioning and boarding the shadow fleet tankers. So to begin with, actually, the EU was very hesitant in doing something about the shadow tankers. So they were afraid to play a game of chicken against the full tanker, right? That's kind of scary. So they were very hesitant to begin with. But then they created this list of shadow tankers. And essentially that's defined as those that break the price cap, and they start sanctioning those. And they are not allowed, the sanction is essentially that they are not allowed to use Western services. They also start boarding these, or especially the Baltic and the Nordic countries, they start boarding the shadow tankers. It's been kind of exciting to watch. What was the effect of this? Well, the effect was unclear or small. We don't know. It's really hard to know what happens, whether there's a decrease in the shadow fleet or not. There seems to be a little bit less of circumvention by the white fleet. But what we can see, I think, is that the transport cost went up for Russia again. During this time, Ukraine also starts attacking Russian oil infrastructure. But that's not in the Baltic, so I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so Russia, then there's this, they start sanctioning the shadow fleet, boarding them, and then Russia starts escorting the shadow tankers with armed personnel on board, or sometimes with the ship on the side. But the EU did not back down on this one, and just continued. Episode 6. The EU starts considering a transport ban. So now we're like December 2025, January 26. So the idea is to replace the price cap by an outright transport ban, essentially saying that those that transport Russian oil, they would lose access to all European oil trade. So essentially the ones that, if you're thinking of transporting Russian oil, that means that either you're choosing between having serving about 10% of the oil market compared to 20 or 25% of the oil market, which involves the EU. So there's the idea of implementing this sanction, but Hungary stands in the way. Then there's elections in Hungary, and things seem to maybe work out, but then things start happening elsewhere in the world. So this is going to be the end of my talk. If I come back next year, I might talk about this, but this is ongoing. So this is like a very fast wrap up. I was citing a lot of papers there. So this is the list of papers that I've based this on, but I'll stop there.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to present our result today. So our organization, our organization is still quite young. It was founded in 2022, just 3 months after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, the founders already had strong professional experience in business, public administration, and cooperation with international donors. For example, Max Nefedov was the first Deputy Minister of Economic Development of Ukraine, and later served as head of the Customs Service of Ukraine. So let's talk about core areas of our expertise. First of all, this is digital transformation. It's reconstruction and risk monitoring, public finance management, law enforcement, economic development and research, analysis and policy insights. Because our team has a lot of experience working with the governmental institution and international organization, we have built a strong network of partners and stakeholders over the years. On the slide, you can see international partners and government. partners. First of all, is Digital Transformation, Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine, Ministry of Communities, Economy, Environmental Protection. Among our international partners are the European Commission, GIZ, government of Norway, Sweden, Save Children, and many other international partners. So let's talk about our research. So first of all, in 2023, we carry out several studies on the environmental impact of the war in Ukraine. The research focused on two main topics: forest ecosystem and Kakhovka Dam. The first topic was the impact of the war on forest ecosystem in the parts of Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv region. For this research, we use satellite-based method called NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, and NBR, Normalized Burn Ratio. This method helps us understand change and vegetation damaged forest and areas affected by fires. As limited time today, I will not go into detail about this part of research. You can learn more about the results using the QR code, or I will be happy to share the materials with you afterwards. Another major study focused on the consequences of the destruction of Kakhovka Dam by Russian forces. So today, this is topic I would like to focus on. So Kakhovka Dam was a part of one of the 6 large water system in the Dnipro River cascade. It was built and filled between 1955 and 1958. The dam was destroyed after the uncontrolled explosion carried out by Russian occupying forces during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the dam and the connected water system played an important role in regulating the flow of Dnipro River. They supported electricity production, irrigation, and the water supply for the dry southern regions of Ukraine. The reservoir connected to the dam was around 230 kilometers long, with an average width of 9.4 kilometers and maximum width of 24 kilometers. Its total area was about more than 2,000 square kilometers and contained around 18.2 cubic kilometers of water. The short line stretched for almost 900 kilometers. So after the destruction of Kakhovka Dam by Russian occupying forces on June 6, 2023, many towns and villages located downstream were flooded. At the same time, the water level in the reservoir dropped by the several meters, causing serious negative effects for agriculture in nearby areas. Before the destruction in 2023, the ecosystem of reservoir was very rich. The coastal areas also served as important nesting place. A lot of species of zooplankton, invertebrates, and fish. Since the area around the former reservoir remains an active war zone, researchers have not been able to fully study the impact of wildlife right now. Regarding the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, our team conducted 2 separate studies. The first study focused on assessing the condition of vegetation in areas located near Kakhovka Dam after its destruction. The research covered several regions in southern Ukraine, includes parts of Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Just like the forest study, we also used 2 satellite-based methods here. The first method was NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. This method helps measure the condition and density of vegetation. It compares reflected light in the visible red spectrum and the near-infrared spectrum. Healthy vegetation reflects light differently, so this allows researchers to identify change in a plant cover and ecosystem health. You can see on the slide the formula. The second method was NBR, normalized burn ratio. This method is mainly used to detect burned and damaged areas and to estimate severity of environmental damage. It works by comparing the near-infrared and short-wave infrared parts of satellite images. So, formula also below on a slide. The second study, first of all, about results. The result of study showed several important environmental changes. First of all, the average NDVI value in 2023 significantly decreased compared to the previous year. This may indicate worsening vegetation health, vegetation loss, drought, and general deterioration of environmental conditions. The area without vegetation increased by more than 1,700 square kilometers. At the same time, the average NBR value in 2023 showed an increase in heavily damaged areas by more than 450 square kilometers, indicated further environmental degradation in the affected regions. Also, you can access the full study using the QR code below in a slide. Based on results of the research, we also developed a BI tool and interactive dashboard. The integration of satellite data into BI system allowed us to create a dashboard that visualizes the environmental consequences of the war in areas near former Kakhovka Dam and Jarlaghach Island. The dashboards uses data collected from satellite images during the research process. One of the key features of the dashboard is ability to classify territories based on the level of environmental damage using NDVI and NBR indicators. For example, it allows users to see how vegetation cover change in selected regions over time. The second study focused on the analysis of flooding affecting residential and non-residential buildings caused by the destruction of Kakhovka Dam. The flooding of large populated areas became a serious problem with a major negative impact on the life, safety, and well-being of local communities. To analyze flooded buildings and identify flood boundaries, we used comprehensive methodology that combines satellite imagery with information from open sources. During the research, we used publicly available satellite images from Sentinel-2 and Maxar. These images help us identify flooded areas and better understand the scale of flooding. We also use specialized software to process and interpret the satellite imagery. This allows us to identify and flooded territories, assess the intensity of flooding, and map flooded boundaries. In addition to satellite data, we use geospatial information from different sources to estimate flood levels affecting buildings. In particular, elevation data from NASA Digital Elevation Model help us calculate a difference in the height between individual buildings, means residential and flood reference points. This made it possible to estimate flood deaths and assess the level of flooding for each building. Overall, this methodology provides a systematic and reliable approach to analyze flooded territories and residential areas by combining satellite imagery, elevation data, open source information. In the slide, you can see pictures from Maxar and also a picture made by a reporter on the ground. If we're talking about result of the analysis, we collected a large number of data on flooded buildings, which allowed us to create detailed overview of the situation. In total, we identified more than 60,000 flooded buildings. These included residential and non-residential buildings, as well as industrial facilities, agriculture infrastructure, school, healthcare facilities, and other types of infrastructure, mostly civil infrastructure. To better assess the impact of flooding, all buildings were divided into 4 categories based on flood depths. Using elevation data and flood level calculation, we estimate the level of flooding for each individual buildings. The categories included fully flooded buildings, above 3 meters, partially flooded buildings between 1 and 3 meters, and possibly flooded buildings flood level up to 1 meter, and also non-flooded buildings. This classification gave us much more detailed understanding of the scale of damage and helped improve the assessment of affected settlements. After the collecting and analyzing the data on flooded buildings, we used the results to create a public dashboard that provides a simple and interactive way to visualize the findings of the study. One of the main elements of the dashboard is a database developed from the collected information on flooded buildings. This database contained detailed information about flooded buildings, their flood level categories, and buildings types. It serves as the foundation for charts, graphs, and interactive maps that show the distribution of flooded buildings across the regions, districts, and flooding categories. The dashboards itself provide an accessible and user-friendly platform for exploring and understanding the results of research. Thank you guys for your attention. Unfortunately, due to bureaucratic issues, I can't share this space personally with you. So we are deeply grateful for your support of Ukraine and your interest in the challenge and the opportunity faced of Ukraine today. Thank you once again.
For 20 minutes until coffee. But thank you so much for all the interesting talks. And I'll start a question towards you, Dominic. You didn't want to talk too much about how conflict affects the environment in the speech, but if I have to press you on that, what do you see as the most important mechanism through which conflict affects the environment? Is it direct physical damage, or is the lasting pollutant, or is it the weakening of democratic institutions? What did you say on that?
Well, I mean, I did a bit of a literature search, and I had the impression that the literature is not, I mean, there's still plenty of things we could study. So I think we're, I mean, it would be kind of topic we could study in much more depth. I mean, there's quite some work, for example, on biodiversity, wildlife. You know, wildlife suffers, of course, from insecurity, much, yeah. So conservation efforts are undermined by conflict. So that's quite clear. Then, of course, there is this the effect of CO2, right? I mean, you know, if you think about it, how absurd it is to produce all these weapons and then blow them up. Then, of course, war also entails attacks on refineries of oil, oil wells that are sometimes put on fire, etc. So some numbers that I saw for Kuwait, for example. One number I saw, don't quote me on that, I'm not a specialist, but the number I saw was something like 2% of global CO2 emissions were due to the burning oil wells in Kuwait. So maybe the source is wrong. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But it illustrates that the thing could be very, you know, could be very relevant. I think that the reason why I'm less into studying that is that the policy conclusions are not that surprising, right? The policy conclusion is don't do wars, but that's something we kind of know that it's not good to do wars. But I think maybe deeper, one policy implication could, of course, be to do some convention, right? For example, that you, so there are some humanitarian rules for wars with the Geneva Convention, for example, that if you take prisoners in war, you treat them well. One could also do an environmental convention where you say, well, some environmental crimes are banned from war. So you cannot explode some dam, or you cannot deliberately kill wildlife, or you cannot put on fire an oil well, or these kind of things. So maybe we should kind of work on a convention on that. But of course, it's second best. First best is not to not do wars, right?
Okay, thank you so much for that one. So Hanna, yeah, Daniel, of course, yeah, feel free.
So I realized that you would ask that kind of question, and so I've been thinking about it, and I essentially drew zero. In the sense that I think that we don't know so much how, compared to the other way around, we don't know so much how conflict affects the environment, and I can just imagine a few channels, and I think all of these channels have been essentially discussed here. So one is the direct effect of war. So you brought up some of that. Essentially, when you bomb stuff or you oil infrastructure or whatever, that's bad for the environment. It might also affect policy, so environmental policy, in the sense that you might not care so much for environmental policy, or maybe you care more about environmental policy. So I think the big question here for policy is whether so now we're living in a world with a lot of rivalry. So geopolitics is starting to play a very big role. So the question is whether we're going to separate into two energy systems and so on. So I think I don't know the answer to these things. It's just how it might affect it. But then there's also this issue of something I would like to call environmental warfare. And at least, I don't know, maybe you found something when you search for it, but I haven't seen much. And essentially that's the deliberate destruction of the environment as part of war. And I can imagine a few reasons why you want to do it. One is that just because you want to hurt people when you fight a war, so you want to essentially lower the fighting morale of the other country. Another is that when you harm the environment, you might harm also the economy of that country. And the third one is simply as deterrence, that you destroy stuff in order to deter other countries. But I haven't seen much like empirical work, not much theory either. So.
Yes, what was that?
Sure.
Maybe first on the environmental part. So there is a movement among lawyers to make ecocide an international crime. So ecocide at the moment is not an international crime. And Kakhovka Dam example specifically that Maxim just presented is also used because the evidence is there, the scale is so massive, and it was a deliberate destruction with a massive implications for ecosystems. So this is currently right now with a lot of government supports, parliaments of many countries, international lawyers, NGOs. This is like a shared advocacy movement to make ecocide an international crime. Like it's not the first time, but just the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and what Russia has been doing just creates this evidence that is really straightforward for many people, because that is also additional point how to keep aggressor accountable. That, for example, in the international court now, Putin is recognized the international criminal for deportation of Ukrainian kids. So ecocide, just one of the examples like that is, if it is made international crime, that it's easier, it creates precedents how you can keep aggressors accountable. Another one on the environment versus war, I've been, it's quite an uncomfortable thought, but then I still share it. There is a lot of now these arguments that weapons, production of weapons and use of weapons associated with higher emissions. But if you look at the longer term, and also Dominic referred to that wars are mostly associated with dictatorships initiate them. Like if you, in simple words, if you don't give, war in Ukraine creates additional emissions, but if you don't arm democracy to protect itself, then you might have much more emissions in the longer term, because if dictatorship wins, that would be associated with the, continuing of the fossil fuels economy. So that kind of discussion is I feel like we could have more of it, because I more and more hear still this peacemaking arguments that, weapons means emissions, but not if you look at the broader picture. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all of you. And Maxim, I wanted to follow up on what Daniel said about that we don't know much about the environmental effects of conflicts and war. And that's something that you and your group is working on. So my question is, what types of environmental damage do you think are most likely underestimated or ignored or hardest to measure?
It's hard to give a correct answer. I think we need take more attention about the ecosystem because a lot of butterflied sea areas also take into account forest ecosystem, and it's many other places, but unfortunately of active combat zone we don't have enough resource to do it personally, also only by using different technology, as I mentioned in my presentation, like Maxar, satellite-based method, and many others. So, but honestly, I don't have correct answer about where we need to pay more attention right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Daniel, I have a follow-up, one more question for you right now. So your presentation shows that we could think of environmental consequences just not only in the active war zone, but also outside, like this time in the Baltic Sea area. So how should environmental economists or economists in general think about this? Is this a type of an externality of a war, or how should we think of these environmental threats that are not in the battlefield, but outside?
It's a difficult question. I don't think I would like to call it an externality because an externality is something that you do unintentionally. I think, I don't know, because I'm not in the head of the Russian regime, but I think that they are, it's convenient for them that the shadow fleet consists of bad tankers. I don't think they mind necessarily if there would be an environmental accident with the tanker, or they could mind because of the counter reaction, but it's a way for them to hurt what they see as their enemy, which is the EU, right? So I don't think externality is the correct word. I think it's deliberate, but then the question is, we don't know to what extent they would want to use it. So I go back to this very basic goal of war, is that you want to harm your enemy without harming yourself. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I have many more questions prepared, but I thought maybe we have since all of you have traveled here, we might have many questions from the audience. Yes, Richard, yeah.
Thanks. I was just wondering about this, what looks very bad, of course, is this burning of oil wells and refineries. But to some extent, that's just moving with all is burnt. Otherwise, it would be burnt in cars and so on. So maybe the environmental damages are a bit smaller than we think.
Want to respond?
Maybe someone else. The direct effect, yes, but then there's going to be a price effect. And I suppose that the price effect when the oil price goes up because you burn up a lot of it could be that others search for more oil, and that could end up causing more emissions. But it could also mean that others start using other energy resources, which could be worse, coal, or they could be better. So it's really hard to say. But I think as an environmental economist, we care about the trade-off between economic welfare and environmental harm. And of course, when you burn oil without using it, that's kind of on the wrong side of that trade-off. So in principle, it's kind of problematic.
Yeah, so I think what we see in the war in Iran, for example, is that well, now maybe let me not talk about Norway. Norway is a bit of the exception. It's like the only European country with a lot of oil, right? But if you take Norway apart, what you see is that actually Europe is in some sense hit very hard by the war in Iran. The US, okay, they of course, the war is costly for them because each missile costs a lot of money. But at the same time, they're a dominant oil producer, and if the oil price goes up for the US, they also have a upside of the higher oil price. While in Europe, as an oil importer, we have hundreds of reasons to go green as soon as we can. So we don't have we don't. I mean, of course, there are some big European countries with big car industry, etc. I understand that, but in general, in Europe has a much stronger incentive, not just for saving the planet, but even economically and in terms of security, autonomy, etc., to immediately get rid of fossil fuels. And so with the Iran war, we kind of see that our interests, our trade-offs are not exactly the same trade-offs as for various superpowers. So in that sense, I think that's something to keep in mind and to move as fast out of fossil fuels as we can.
Do you have other questions from the audience? Yes, Julia.
Thank you. I have maybe a very basic comment and related to the previous question. But like to start with, I'd like to stress the connection and the complementarity between Dominic's lecture and Daniel's talk. That is, in a sense, like Dominic's looking at the factors triggering wars and peace, and Daniel specifically looks at what we currently do in a situation of wars in order to make it stop. And you make a bit of that connection, saying, well, the objective of sanctions is to reduce rents that finance wars. And you also talk about the environmental consequences of evasion, like the shadow fleet and the risk of oil spills. But there is something else that can be stressed. It is that there's been, like in that literature about sanctions, like a trade-off between around the radicality of sanctions, the intensity of sanctions. And it is that, so I like to put it like that. On the one hand, from a climate perspective, there is too much oil. And suddenly, we need to sanction countries like Russia, and there's not enough oil. And I think it's important to stress that, in fact, the most basic sanction is to just cut our oil use. So climate policy is not incompatible with sanctioning oil states. And I think it's important to stress that. Yeah.
I would like to stress that even more. Looking at the sanctions, now I'm talking as like normatively from a policy perspective. In my view, the biggest failure of the EU after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is that we collectively lowered our fuel taxes. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine, we had a stronger reason to have climate policy than we had before. It was a reason on top of all the climate reasons that we had before, but what we did was that we lowered the taxes. Yeah.
Yes.
So I just want to have a brief comment on something you said earlier about the equal distribution of benefits from climate policy. Powerful people, rich people have a lot of power, and in some countries, rich people do a lot to sabotage climate policy. So it may be that particularly in the US, but also to some extent in Norway, giving the rich people a larger piece of the pie that's generated by a sensible climate policy may actually be helpful. That's a very depressing thought, but still. The other thing I just want to mention is that there is one thing we haven't talked about here at all today, and that is demography. Now, demography is going to affect the world in extremely profound ways for the next 40, 50 years that are coming. According to the UN, the population of China will be half of its current size by around 2050, 2060. That is a demographic collapse in peacetime that is unprecedented, with the exception of severe epidemics. So, and this is going on all over the world, and I'm wondering how you guys see this demographic collapse as something that could actually be helpful, both to reduce crises and wars, and also to reduce the climate footprint of the human activity. Thank you.
Dominic, do you want to start?
Yeah, no. I mean, the logic that you sketch is, of course, in some sense compelling, but I still kind of politically object. So, for example, I have these discussions with various colleagues and co-authors who, some of them are in computational economics, and so they kind of they look at these very sophisticated Nordhaus style models for what kind of carbon policies you should put in place, and sometimes they reach a conclusion that's in line with what you're saying. Sometimes they reach the conclusion that in order to bribe the rich country, the rich people, which is basically us in the room, right, to bribe the current generation of rich countries from spending more CO2, you would have kind of future generations, especially in poor countries, to pay for that. So that's some of the conclusion that they find, and I just find it, I understand the logic. It's a logic of incentive compatibility, where if the rich elderly people today don't want to put in place policies, well, you want to. I understand the logic of the argument, but still, in some sense, from a moral point of view, it still seems kind of shocking, the idea that a new generation in a poor country would kind of bribe us to stop overusing CO2 in Switzerland, in Nordic countries, in other rich countries. I still, I feel we created the mess, so we should kind of clean up the mess, and we should cut emissions for free and immediately, and we should, like Esther Duflo has calculated, how much the rich countries actually owe the poor countries in terms of paying for climate mitigation measures and stuff. So I understand the kind of the calculus you make under presuming that people are selfish, and what kind of policies one could implement that are implementable because they're incentive compatible. I understand the logic, but I still kind of find it revolting. So I still think that we should kind of be better than that. But I know that I guess what you mean is probably compatible with what I mean. I don't know.
I find it equally repulsive.
Exactly. Okay. So we're
unavoidable.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have -1 minute left. So I'm just before we go to coffee. So considering the war in Ukraine, so I want to ask you, Hanna, if you could end, and Maxime as well, maybe, if there's one topic or one thing that environmental and resource economists could work on, which is related to the war in Ukraine, what would that be? in the next coming years?
Oh, I don't know. I need to think. Let me think while answering. I actually wanted to go back to your question to Maxime. What are the data that had to collect? I think I might have some answer to that.
That could be the answer to this question as well.
Yeah.
So
here we go. So there are two problems with environmental data in Ukraine because the war is still ongoing, and that's a safety of collecting data. That means first of all, of course, you cannot go to occupied territory and collect data. That is understandably why, but even on deoccupied territory, sometimes there is so much land that is mined that is just not safe to be there. You can be under artillery attacks, even though you're on the territory of Ukraine is not occupied. So that's just basically how do you get soil samples? How do you get water samples? That is a safety reason. And for that, some of the scientists collaborate with the military brigades. So that is actually already happening. For example, for soil samples of water, that is actual practice, citizen science, and collaboration with military brigades. We also have a lot of R&D happening at the level of military brigades in Ukraine. So it's quite a fascinating topic in itself. And the second one is the delayed effects in time. So, for example, we know that in the soil we have heavy metals, so we have chemical pollution, all possible pollution, but it will also take some time to understand, for example, the longer term effects on the groundwater, what it means for the system, just natural cycles. So that's also we're going to see in the upcoming years. So basically keeping an eye on all the main ecosystems and production capacities. And I think it is the main message is also stay connected to the research and the research that is going on. I think that is a lot of really interesting and with a global relevance, environmental economics, inputs for your research that can be brought from Ukraine, an example right now. So stay connected with researchers in Ukraine and with other researchers around Europe and the world that do research in that area. And I think we yet to learn a lot of things in the upcoming years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time, so we have to end it here. I want to thank you, all four of you speakers, for very excellent presentations. Sorry. Yeah, Maxime, you could end.
Just yes, I want to add it to Hanna, and due to the rapid development of drone technology, the zone of death is constantly expanding, and collecting reliable data is becoming increasingly difficult and really dangerous.
Okay, thank you so much thank you for the audience as well for attending. And we have coffee, and then we continue with the parallel sessions. Thank you again.